Hello and welcome to episode 31 of On Liberty from the Center for Independent Studies. I'm your host, Salvatore Babones, and joining me today is veteran journalist Tom Switzer, host of Between the Lines on ABC Radio National. Oh, that's right, and executive director of the Center for Independent Studies, Tom Switzer. Welcome to On Liberty.
Salvatore, it's great to be with you, and can I say from the outset, congratulations on a great show. You know, one of the silver linings to this pandemic for think tanks has been able to use this great technology such as Zoom, and you've run a really good show right from the outset of the pandemic. I think it started in early April and it's going great. I'll never miss an episode, so it's great to be here finally.
Well, thank you. I want to challenge you at the outset. Tom Switzer, Executive Director of the Center for Independent Studies, has your organization accepted $650,000 donation from pedophile and sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein?
Look, it's really no laughing matter. Of course not, no. And I'm actually surprised that Kevin Rudd, who's an old friend of mine, as chairman of this think tank, certainly over the last 2 to 3 years, and as a board member since 2014.
Not this think tank, mind you. Yes, International Peace Institute. Yes.
International Peace Institute, I think it's based in Norway. I think it's one thing for a board member not to be aware of all the financial donations. I don't blame him when he was a board member, but as chairman since early 2018, he should have been aware that, $650,000 presumably came in over a period of 5 or so years, but I'm struck that he wasn't aware of it. I've dealt with 2 chairmen directly here at CIS during my tenure, Peter Mason in 2017, 2018, and Nicholas Moore since early 2019. And mark my words, they would look at all the prominent donations, and if they had seen that Jeffrey Epstein had donated significant money to CIS, that's a red flag. So I think that the best thing you can say about Kevin Rudd here is that he was derelict in his duty.
Well, I think I know 2 chairmen who are going to be quite relieved when they watch today's episode of On Liberty. But Tom,
they're very good chairman.
Let's get to the main event. Trump or Biden, who's going to win?
Well, all the available public polling evidence, for what it's worth, not to mention the betting markets and the so-called experts, they expect Joe Biden to win. However, as I've argued many times during the course of the last few weeks, whenever one predicts a Biden victory, we have to acknowledge that we also thought that Donald Trump would lose 4 years ago. Mm-hmm. And some of us knew that there was a pathway there for Trump if he could find a way of depressing the Democratic base vote while at the same time turning out the so-called great unwashed. And Trump shocked us, but he was helped immeasurably by Hillary Clinton, who took her own voters for granted and then went about demeaning Donald Trump's voters as deplorables. So we have to recognise that we were wrong 4 years ago. Many of us were also wrong about the Australian federal election early last year, and some of us were wrong about Brexit 4 years ago. So the polls aren't an exact science. They never have been, but they've become less reliable over the years. Biden currently has, according to the Real Clear Average Politics, a lead of something like 7% in the national polls. But the key, as you well know, Salvatore, is those battleground states, and that's right, where the race has narrowed.
Right. But let me ask you a more important question. As someone who directs a think tank, who's in the world of ideas, who should win?
You know, it's a bit like what Henry Kissinger said during the Iraq-Iran war in the 1980s. It's too bad both sides can't lose. I know that sounds a bit crude, but I carry no brief for the Democrats. I think that the centre of gravity in the Democratic Party has lurched to the left in the last decade, particularly since the arrival of Bernie Sanders when he rudely burst on the scene in 2015, 2016. The party activists are genuine socialists. I'm not saying they sympathise with the old communism, but they want much higher levels of government intervention in the economy. And they are pushing this ghastly cancel culture onto the American community. So I think the Democrats have all sorts of problems, although I think Biden himself is instinctively a mainstream centre-left pragmatic politician. The problem, though, is that he has no firm convictions. He's weak and he's widely seen as a Trojan horse for the increasingly dominant left faction of the Democratic Party. On Trump, look, he's done some very good things. As you say, I'm head of CIS, so we believe in small markets, free competition, productivity enhancing reform, and there's no question that the tax cuts, both income and company tax cuts, plus deregulation that Donald Trump pushed in 2017, 2018, helped lead to America's booming economy. So he's done some good things. I'd even applaud some of his foreign policy decisions. However, he is so rude and crude and lewd that it makes it very difficult for someone who believes in an inclusive and prudent conservatism to really embrace such a guy. He has, I think, debased public discourse in the United States. And that's why it's very reluctant for someone like me to be an enthusiastic supporter of Donald Trump. I readily concede that there are a lot of supporters of CIS, a lot of my conservative friends, both here in Australia and in America, who do like the Donald. And perhaps there's understandable reasons because he attracts the right enemies. But in terms of a public policy figure, he's not my kind of guy.
I think we maybe saw a completely different and maybe a rebranded, newly educated Donald Trump in the second presidential debate. Would you reverse what you just said if you could have, well, debate 2 Trump instead of debate 1 Trump?
You know, Salvatore, I think that if Donald Trump loses this election, he might look back at that first debate as being a real turning point. It was a depressing debate spectacle. Biden was marginally better, but Donald Trump was exceedingly rude. I just watched it in the office with a couple of our CIS colleagues and I cringed so many times. But you're quite right. The second debate was a much more disciplined performance by Trump. And I think he made some good points, particularly on the question of Biden's pledge to transition. That was his word, transition a lot of shale gas, oil workers, coal workers away from fossil fuels into renewables. Now, whatever you think about climate change and the whole process of decarbonising the economy, this is a process that is happening around the world, but it's the way you go about doing it. And I thought Trump had a really good response that transitioning people, hundreds of thousands of people, by the way, who work in battleground states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Texas, which is now a battleground state, hard to believe. There are a lot of folks in those states that are heavily dependent on fossil fuels for their livelihoods. And I think the danger for Biden here is that he's doing a bit what like Shorten did in 2019, Bill Shorten, the Labor opposition leader, saying that it's easy to transition from one industry to another at a very quick period of time. That'll displace a lot of people and that creates a lot of angst. And I suspect a lot of those folks in those industries will vote for Donald Trump. And that debate helped Donald Trump on that issue.
Let me say a quick hello to some of our viewers, Gay, Anthony, Suresh, Mike. We're thrilled to have you watching today. All the rest of you who are watching, get in there in the comments box, get your questions in. We'll get to questions obviously in a few minutes. Tom, of course, we can't avoid this year talking about coronavirus, and Donald Trump has taken a lot of heat for his poor leadership during the coronavirus crisis. That said, the U.S. has done no worse than other Western democracies, in Western Europe, where leaders have been praised for their coronavirus response. Why has coronavirus become such an albatross around Trump's neck when, for Merkel, for Macron, even for Boris Johnson, it doesn't seem to have really hurt them?
Well, it's a very good point. I mean, all too often Trump gets attacked by the media for his handling of the crisis. I think in some respects that's justified, by the way. But they do overlook what's happening on the European continent, don't they? It's a very good point. I understand that the United States represents the world's 4% of the world's population, and figures that I read in Real Clear Politics just recently, 22% of the world's COVID deaths. So by that criteria, that's a catastrophic failure for any administration. Having said that, a lot of the blame also goes to the states in the United States. I mean, New York State, for example, is a very democratic state.
Right.
Cuomo, the governor there, doesn't seem to cop the kind of criticism that Trump does. And the other point to bear in mind, and this is a point that Trump made in the second debate against Joe Biden, is that when Donald Trump, around the time that Scott Morrison did the same thing, when they put a ban on China travel, I think this was in late January, early February, very early on, Trump was denounced by many Democrats, including Joe Biden, including the Democratic House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, for indulging in either racism or xenophobia or both. But Trump was right on that issue. And again, I don't think the media have held senior Democrats to account for getting that decision horribly wrong.
Right. Let me turn to the economy. Now, of course, all developed countries and many less developed countries have had severe economic recessions due to coronavirus. Yet, according to OECD estimates, the United States is going to have the best performing economy this year among rich OECD countries. That is, it's going to have a recession, but a much more mild recession than others. Now, perhaps not coincidentally, the United States is the only country that has not had a major coronavirus rescue package, a government organized rescue package. How do you square these? Are the rescue packages maybe doing more economic harm than good?
Well, look, some of our listeners may have heard me make this point before. It's a quote from Jonathan Friedland from The Guardian. I always, by the way, read The Guardian. I prefer the UK Guardian to the Australian Guardian because I always want to know what our enemies and opponents are saying. I think it's always important, you know, the John Stuart Mill, that those who know only their view knows little of it, and only until you've rebutted your opponent's arguments at their strongest do you know your own side's weaknesses. So I always read The Guardian every day. And at the height of the crisis in probably the third week of March, Jonathan Friedland, who's one of my favourite left-leaning journalists, he quipped that just as there are no atheists on a sinking ship, there are no free marketeers during a pandemic. And I think that is actually what's happened. All major industrialised countries have presided over much higher levels of government spending and stimulus packages and income support measures. The United States, to be fair, Salvatore, has pump-primed the economy in a major way, but they haven't had the kind of wage subsidies that are clearly evident in this country and in Britain and many parts of Europe. Look, I think the way out of this crisis is for governments to put in place sound productivity-enhancing reforms that create incentives for entrepreneurs to grow the economy, to create wealth, to hire people. That's the way we're going to get out of this crisis. And I think that's actually one of Donald Trump's strongest messages, if he stays on message, that the Republican strategy of market economics is the best way of getting America out of this pandemic-induced recession. It's a key point to make. We're in a recession around the world, but it's not the fault of markets. It's not the fault of competition. It's not the fault of business. We're in this liquidity crisis because it's a government-induced recession. It's a virus-induced recession. The government has shut down the economy for much of the year, and it's designed to fight the virus. That's the reason why we're in this recession. So be wary of those of our intellectual opponents who are trying to use this crisis as a justification to permanently expand the size of government and therefore the burden on taxpayers. We need to release burdens on taxpayers to grow the economy. And my sense is that the Republican Party would be better at that than the Democratic Party.
Well, let me push you a little bit more on this, because this is something I find fascinating, that in the United States, you see my pin right there, our political system has been criticized for not delivering the kinds of coronavirus relief that other countries have because of our supposedly dysfunctional political system where Democrats and Republicans can't work together. Yet, U.S. GDP for the third quarter is going to be released today in the U.S. The expectation, the consensus forecast, is 35% growth. And in the U.S., the coronavirus recession is essentially over. Now, I want to just really push this point. The one country that has not had a massive coordinated coronavirus economic response is the one country that's growing fastest now and that the OECD expects will grow fastest next year. What do you think?
Well, there's a lot of truth to that, but again, you don't want to, ignore the fact that Congress has already passed pretty significant stimulus packages to government or debt money to pump prime.
Well, a one-time cash payment.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But no further.
Well, and also bear in mind that Congress and the President are currently deliberating a new stimulus package. and that probably won't be passed until after the election.
Right.
And if the Democrats regain the House and win the Senate, and if Biden's the president, then you'll get even a much bigger stimulus bill that's passed through the legislature. So, look, let's not overstate Trump's market reform credentials here. He's a populist, he's a protectionist. He's done some good things on tax cuts and deregulation, but I don't think his instincts are to subscribe to fiscal rigour and discipline. I think politicians who support those kind of policies, such as Paul Ryan, the former Speaker of the House, they're in very short supply in today's Washington.
Let me say some more hellos. Chris, Christopher, Cameron, Winton, Courtney, great to have you watching today. Now, Tom, there's some really tragic but also alarming news coming out of Philadelphia, where we've seen another outbreak of rioting in the United States. This was due to a killing of an African-American man by a police officer. Now, that African-American man was armed with a knife and apparently hostile when shot. So this is not one of those cases of egregious police violence. There may be an argument that there was excessive use of force, but when someone comes at you with a knife, we certainly can have some broad latitude for people overreacting. Nonetheless, it still resulted in riots that have seen looting, burning in Philadelphia. Now, Pennsylvania is one of the main battleground states seen as must-win by both candidates. How do you think this Philadelphia rioting, what are the political implications of it for next week's election?
Well, you're absolutely right, Salvatore. This is yet another case. It's a familiar story, isn't it? And this is this time it's the city of brotherly love. As you know, that's how Philadelphia is termed.
Its own ironic term for itself. Yes, yes.
City of brotherly love. I always think about that when my beloved Dallas Cowboys play in Philadelphia. It's the Philadelphia Eagles, and their fans are the nastiest fans in the NFL. But I changed the subject. But look, it's a familiar story where these riots break out after the shooting of an African-American man by police. It's a depressing story. It precedes Donald Trump. This happened during the Obama years. It's wrong to blame Trump for this. I think there is a genuine issue of police brutality. Having said that, though, I do think that some of these progressive cities, and Philadelphia is a quintessential progressive city. This is the Wall Street Journal editorial board. They just make the point that decisions by their leadership are not likely to reduce these kind of tragedies. And this is from the Wall Street Journal. The city council, so this was just after the recent northern summer in Philadelphia, the city council reduced police funding by more than $33 million. Later this week, the council in Philadelphia is expected to vote on a bill that would permanently ban tear gas, pepper spray, and other less than lethal weapons during protests. Now, answering your question, I think that the decisions by the progressive leadership in Philadelphia warmed the hearts of many of those socialists and left-wing activists in the Democratic Party. However, I do think those kind of decisions do disturb a lot of those suburban voters in Philadelphia. So, as you probably know, a lot of the college-educated suburban voters in many suburbs of Philadelphia, in 2016, they held their nose to vote for Donald Trump because they held Hillary Clinton with disdain. However, this time, all the available evidence indicates that those same voters will either stay at home or even vote for Joe Biden because they can't stand Donald Trump's polarizing style of politics, never mind his character and temperament. That said, these kind of decisions will make those folks more likely to actually vote for Donald Trump, I would imagine, because law and order is a big issue for a Republican, particularly when progressive cities are pursuing policies like defund the police.
Well, thanks, Tom. Now is the time that everyone's been waiting for. It's the moment when I ask our viewers to please like this video, subscribe to the CIS YouTube channel. You'll be glad you did, but you won't just be glad you did. We'll be glad you did, because the more people who engage with the video, those comments down in the box, those like buttons, the subscriptions, encourages YouTube to show the video to other people. And that's what we'd really like. We'd really like to get this message out to as broad an audience as possible. We'd also love to have you as a member. Joining the Center for Independent Studies is only $40. That's Australian dollars. For those of you overseas, that might sound like even less for you. If you're already a member, you can upgrade to the $250 membership level. And if you do upgrade, I will send you a copy of Liberty and Liberalism, a signed copy, personally signed by me. The first work of classical liberalism published in Australia, republished by the Center for Independent Studies under Tom's predecessor, Greg.
Crikey, Salvatore, so you're doing my job better than I do.
Tom, everyone does your job better than you do, but we still love you. And in fact, we have so many questions. I had to cut short the questions I have for you because we have so many from the audience. Everybody wants to either.
It is interesting. American politics, I've found throughout the last 20 years when I've been a commentator on American politics, it's amazing how many Australians are interested in the subject, isn't it?
Everyone wants to either pick your brain or suck it out, one or the other, depending how they feel about what you've said today. And I'm going to start with one that's maybe a hostile comment, but question, but well, you judge. Suresh in Melbourne asks, how critical is the concentration of media power? And he's especially worried about the manipulation by the Murdoch press in determining the results of the U.S. election.
Well, Suresh, as you know, the aforementioned Kevin Rudd is trying to kickstart a royal commission into this very question in the Australian context. But Murdoch has far more influence and reach in this country than he does in the United States. I mean, in the United States, he's got the Fox News channel, he's got the New York Post, the Wall Street Journal. They're the three main outlets, I think. Plus obviously the Fox channel. Now, I've been watching Fox News since I lived in Washington in 1996. I go through phases. I used to watch Fox News Special Report, which is 6 o'clock on the East Coast every night because they had an outstanding panel, including one of my favourite columnists, Charles Krauthammer, who was a critic of Donald Trump's, by the way. He's now dead. But there is significant influence of the Fox News channel in the Republican Party grassroots. I think that's true. But as a percentage of the media market, it's still pretty small. It's a very fragmented market in the United States. And you have to remember that the broad cross-section of the media in the United States, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, CBS, NBC, ABC American News, PBS, NPR, the public broadcasters, not to mention MSNBC on the cable network, CNN. Suresh, they're overwhelmingly not just anti-Trump, which is somewhat understandable because in many respects Trump brings this media scrutiny onto himself, but they're very anti-Republican. And I made this point yesterday at the National Press Club in Canberra, that what's happening here is that the term objective journalism, it's increasingly a misnomer because every day, every decision in newsrooms made by editors and reporters subjectively. They let their own biases cloud their judgment. Now, sometimes they don't do this as deliberately as, say, some Fox News hosts, but it's evident. And nothing demonstrates that point more than the media campaign against Trump on the Russiagate controversy. I mean, for the first 2 years of Trump's presidency, the mainstream media, morning, noon and night, went after Trump on this allegation that his campaign was in cahoots or in collusion with Moscow. And as the Mueller report made very clear, there was no evidence to support those claims. If anything, there are questions to be asked about the connection between the outgoing Obama administration officials in late 2016, early 2017, and the FBI. The mainstream media doesn't cover that. Only Fox News and the Wall Street Journal really cover those issues. So I do think it's more complicated than the premise of your question, but it's a good one because we're having that debate right now in Australia, which I think is probably more understandable given that Murdoch really does have more say in the Australian debate than he does in America. All
right, now Tom,
I don't agree with Kevin Rudd on the Royal Commission, but I can understand why many of our opponents would make those kind of calls. Sorry,
Tom, I'll give you a break from my overly critical comments to give you one from Mike. I agree with everything you say, Tom. It's hard to support the Donald, but there's nothing good about the New Democrats. Chris asks an early question. Well, it was an early question. We took so long to get to it. I'm sorry, Chris. What effect, if any, do you think the Tony Bobulinski revelations, and this was the interview where Bobulinski talked about Hunter Biden and said that these emails specifically referred to Joe Biden as the big guy being involved and paid off in these Hunter Biden scandals. What do you think this effect and dodgy Hunter Biden laptop contents will have on the American voting public?
My sense is it won't have a huge impact because the story is pretty much confined to the New York Post and Fox News, the Murdoch outlets that Suresh mentioned, and to a lesser extent, the Wall Street Journal editorial page. The news pages of all the major newspapers and media outlets generally, they claim they can't verify the story. That's why they're not reporting it. That might be true. What is inexcusable is that those big tech companies like Facebook and Twitter are censoring the story. I don't think that's their role. If it's not a verifiable story, people will find out. But I don't think that the big tech companies should be censoring that. And to the extent that they have, it may well be counterproductive. I think it's a story that really just reaffirms the sentiments of Donald Trump's base, which is a very strong 45% of the electorate. I'm not sure that many people who want to see the end of Trump are going to be swayed by a story that is essentially about Joe Biden's son, Hunter. So I suspect it will have a limited impact, Salvatore.
Okay. Christopher is curious, has losers' consent gone out the window, making it far more difficult for a prospective Biden-Harris administration to pursue its agenda? And I might add, making it more difficult for a prospective Trump administration, Trump-Pence administration, to pursue their agenda?
Well, it depends on the outcome of the election. I mean, my great fear, and I suspect this will be the case, is that the Democrats keep the House of Representatives. They have a decent chance of winning the Senate. I mean, when you have states like South Carolina and Arizona, which are red states, they're Republican states. This is the state of Lindsey Graham in South Carolina. It's the state of Barry Goldwater, the conscience of American conservatism, and John McCain. When the polls say that the Republicans could lose those Senate seats, there's a decent chance the Democrats might just pick the Senate. And if the polls are right and Biden wins the election, the Democrats, you just watch. They will use this opportunity over the next 2 years to make some serious radical changes. They're more than likely going to end the Senate filibuster, which forestalls the need to compromise with the minority. You need 60 votes to pass major legislation. That'll mean it'll be just 50 votes. Democrats would have the numbers. They'd probably stack the Supreme Court. They'd probably just appoint or nominate and confirm 2 left liberal justices to the Supreme Court, which would help stabilise the balance of power on the Supreme Court. And they're more than likely going to, if they get control of the legislature and the executive, there's a very good chance, I think, that they will grant statehood to Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C., and with them 2 new senators over the next 4 years. And those senators are more than likely going to be Democratic senators. And this will allow the legislature, you would think, to put in place a lot of those pent-up progressive ambitions. I wouldn't rule that prospect out. Having said that, Barack Obama and Bill Clinton had control of the Senate and the House during their first 2 years of their presidency, and they met the wrath of the electorate at the midterm elections in '94 for Bill Clinton and 2010 in Barack Obama. So there are risks in going down this road, but I think if the Democrats get control of the Congress, don't be surprised if they try to ram through a lot of progressive legislation. And that would not be the kind of legacy, by the way, you would expect from a populist disruptor in Washington.
Well, let me follow up, and with apologies to our listeners who have their questions waiting, but I just can't.
I'll try to be shorter. Sorry.
No, it's I'm the one inserting an extra question. The Democratic narrative, if they were to appoint new Supreme Court justices, would be that the Trump interlude was some kind of aberration in American politics that had to be corrected. And it strikes me that many mainstream Republicans would probably go along with that interpretation. Do you think that many establishment Republicans would actually welcome a democratic sweep as long as it swept away the legacy of Donald Trump.
Oh, no question. I mean, you may recall my interview with George F. Will, the distinguished Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist from the Washington Post. He's been writing a column for the Post twice a week since 1973-74. He was scheduled to be our John Benithan lecturer this year, but we did a Zoom event that's attracted more than 420,000 views. It's not because of me, it's because of George Will. And he's your classic never Trump conservative. And there are people like him in the Senate, in the House. They're a minority, though. No, I think Donald Trump has completely transformed the Republican Party. This is Will's point too. It's no longer the party of Ronald Reagan. It's the party of Donald Trump. And my sense is that those mainstream Republicans that you mentioned, they may vote for Biden this time, but I don't think they'd, with the exception of perhaps some foreign policy decisions, they wouldn't really embrace his cultural, social and economic agenda. Those folks you mentioned, I think, are going to be increasingly homeless. And look, this represents the fragmentation of politics around the world. In the United States, the Democratic Party, despite the fact they may well win big next week, is a very divided party. You've got the socialists, left-wing progressive types who are the activists. That's where all the energy is. They support people like Bernie Sanders. But then you've got the establishment wing. They get their funding from Silicon Valley and Wall Street. They support the more centrist or centre-left view of the Democratic Party. But the Republican Party is also divided, where you've got the Trump populists and then the old mainstream Republicans. But those old mainstream Republicans, Salvatore, I think are becoming increasingly extinct.
Well, on that question, Winton very kindly asks, do you think Americans should be worried about a new kind of liberal authoritarianism if Biden wins? And I say kindly because he's obviously read my book, The New Authoritarianism. Thank you, Winton.
Which is a very good book that was reviewed very favorably by the Wall Street Journal.
Well, thank you, Tom. But do you think we should be worried if Biden wins, if there's that kind of sweep of a new kind of liberal authoritarianism in the United States?
Look, there's always a danger in overstating one's case. It depends on the circumstances and the conditions at the moment. But look, I think that Winston makes a point essentially about this ghastly cancel culture, and we at CIS have published and written a lot about this subject over the course of the last year or two. This cancel culture, which has got worse during the Trump era, by the way, and I wonder if that's because the left are fighting back against Trump. In other words, Trump might be making a bad situation worse, even though his instincts are right. But this cancel culture has far more reach and influence in the United States than it does here in Australia or New Zealand, by far. And I'll give you an example. A Boeing executive was forced to resign a few months ago after he was subjected to a nasty Twitter mob campaign. And his sin was in 1987, 33 years ago. He wrote an article, I think it was in a student journal, saying that women should not fight in combat, military combat, which was the mainstream view at the time. And he had to resign as an executive from Boeing. A few months ago, shortly after the death of George Floyd, a University of Chicago economist tweeted that the Black Lives Matter movement has shot itself in the foot by supporting calls to defund the police. Well, again, he was subjected to this nasty Twitter campaign, and the result, he was kicked off the Federal Reserve of Chicago. I mean, this is where people's livelihoods have been upended because they dare air unfashionable views. And I think Winston's point's a good one. Will these trends continue if the Democrats have a clean sweep?
Right.
It's very disturbing.
Cameron asks, how much do you attribute President Trump's apparent combativeness to his, well, frankly, excruciating treatment by the mainstream media, the debate moderators, Hollywood, I mean, the whole intelligentsia? I mean, wouldn't you also get defensive if you had the whole intellectual world against you? And I'm not including Hollywood in the intellectual world.
Well, look, I think polarisation goes both ways. There are a lot of commentators who think that Donald Trump is responsible for this crisis, this polarisation, the hyper-partisanship, but he's a symptom. In 2013, 2014, Robert Gates, who was the defence secretary to Presidents Bush and Obama, Republican and Democrat, he was asked, what's the greatest national security threat that the United States faces? And he said it was the 2 square miles that encompasses the Capitol building and the White House. The polarisation, the hyperpartisanship. Now, he made those remarks well before Donald Trump arrived on the scene. That polarisation's got worse during the last 4 years, but it's not all Donald Trump's fault. Remember Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House. She tore up the President's State of the Union address behind her podium earlier this year. Remember Maxine Waters. She's a veteran Democratic Congresswoman from California. She's called on people to harass, intimidate and bully Trump officials whenever they're seen at restaurants or gas stations or outside their home. If you wear a MAGA hat, a Make America Great hat, there's a good chance that in polite society you'll be denounced as a racist, as that young kid experienced at that pro-life rally early last year. You know, Trump is fighting back against this. So it's very simplistic to blame Donald Trump for the toxic polarisation. He's fighting it back against what he sees as very nasty left-wing activists. And there is some truth to that, as I just said.
Well, following up on that, Gay asks, is this hostility really more about the message than about the man? We always focus on Donald Trump himself, but is the real problem that people don't like his message and, to extend that, his supporters?
Well, you've got to remember when Trump burst on the scene in 2015, 2016, it took a while for many of us seasoned experts to understand what was going on here, but he was tapping into widespread legitimate anxieties about the state of middle America. And I have to say, to some extent, the same thing could be said about Bernie Sanders and the Democratic Party. Francis Fukuyama, the distinguished American intellectual who's been a guest here at CIS several times, had a very important article in Foreign Affairs in the northern summer of 2016, and he made the point that Sanders and Trump, although they express themselves in different ways, represent 2 sides of the same coin. This populist backlash against an establishment in Washington and New York that have made the lives of a lot of ordinary people worse. And by that they meant globalisation, technological change, identity politics. A lot of these folks were the losers of globalisation and technological change, and they were unhappy about the pace of radical socio-cultural change as well. And that's why they turned to people like Trump. Now, does Trump have the answers for these folks? I don't think so. But at the same time, it's understandable why he's resonating with so many folks who feel let down by the Washington elite, both sides of politics.
Now, we still have 4 or 5 questions and comments waiting, but it's time for us to start wrapping up. I apologize to our listeners that I took too much time asking my own queses, not enough asking yours.
Well, look, Salvatore, can I just jump in and say that those folks, if they really wanted, they're more than welcome to email me, and I'll respond to them later today if they like.
Fantastic. That's very generous of you, Tom. I do have to ask you one final question, which is, what does all this mean for Australia? Australians are fascinated by the U.S. election. They're very passionate about it. Does it actually matter for Australia?
Well, I think the United States will remain our most important security ally, regardless of who wins next week. And that's because there are very important defence and security ties between Washington and Canberra that go back to the end of World War II and the onset of the Cold War and the Suez Crisis in 1956. And I think in many respects it's driven by genuine anxiety about China's rise. So that alliance will continue. But in terms of the politics of it, I think we in Australia, despite the fact that we often fret and moan about the state of our public discourse, and the last 10 years have seen a lot of churning of our political leaders, and we fret and wail about social media and the toxic and destabilising impact that has on public discourse. And that's all true, but I think we should take a moment here to recognise that as bad as things are here in this country, I think the polarisation and the partisanship is much worse in Washington. And I don't know how this comes to an end.
Tom Switzer, thank you very much for joining us today on Liberty.
Always a pleasure. Great to be with you, Salvatore, and great show. Thanks so much.
Thanks. And I look forward to watching your episode as well. You said you watch every episode. You'll have to watch this one, that's for sure.
Yeah, and next week, of course, if Trump wins, I should let all our supporters who think and hope Trump wins hold me to account. Make sure that I wipe the egg off my face if Trump wins.
Tom, no one's going to win next week, but we will follow up in 3 or 4 weeks when the election is finally called. Thanks also to our producer, Emily Holmes, our executive producer, Max Hawk Weaver. The executive director of the Center for Independent Studies is none other than Tom Switzer. I'm Salvatore Babones. Next week, James Morrow. Watch us then.
Thanks, Salvatore. That was great, mate. I hope you enjoyed it.